So ExileCon took place just the other week, during which they held a major showcase for their upcoming game, Path of Exile 2. This gave us loads of new information, updates, and details about the game that we hadn't previously known. And Grinding Gears Games reached out to me asking to sponsor a video where I simply talk about the game itself. No guidelines, no requirements. They said, hey, just share your thoughts about Path of Exile 2 with your audience. Yeah, okay. Or I was planning on doing that anyways. As someone who played Path of Exile all the way back in the beta, which is 2011 it was. That was like almost 12 years ago at this point. And although admittedly I haven't been keeping up with the game over the years, I have admired it from a distance. I know a lot of people, fans of ARPGs in particular, consider that to be just one of the pinnacle of the genre. So I am totally happy and looking forward to checking out Path of Exile 2 period. So I'm happy to talk with you about it here in today's video. And what I actually want to do is talk about some of the bigger things about PoE 2 that I think personally are the most interesting. So first and foremost, there is the fact that Path of Exile 1 and 2 are going to be entirely separate games. Now, while you might say, no duh, of course that's the case, this actually wasn't originally the case. At first, Path of Exile 2 was basically going to just be like a major overhaul and update to Path of Exile 1. The game was just going to be basically morphing from PoE 1 into PoE 2, but now that is not the case. This is pretty significant because it means a few big things. Beyond the obvious and expected probably engine and visual improvements, this is going to mean that Path of Exile 1 and 2 will have separate content, separate mechanics, separate balancing, separate updates, and separate leagues with alternating releases. Yes, they are two separate games, right? With them having these separate leagues and alternating releases, this is actually going to mean for people who just like Path of Exile, the franchise, it's going to mean less downtime between their seasons or their leagues, letting you, if you want to, bounce between playing a PoE 1 league and then moving into the PoE 2 league and just kind of going back and forth between those two, maybe throwing in some other games in the mix here and there as well. But then also with them being entirely separate, this is going to let them take a lot more chances and risks and try new things with Path of Exile 2 when it comes to adding mechanics and balance updates and all of this stuff that maybe they wouldn't want to do, or just trying to do something different, right? So now one potential drawback that might first jump to your mind is, hey, you know, I've been playing Path of Exile 1 for a long time, or I've spent a lot of money in the past on microtransactions, on cosmetics, on convenience things like stash tabs. Well, even though they're making them two separate games, they're doing you a solid and having everything between the two that is compatible transfer. So any of the cosmetics, or even more importantly, those convenience features like paid stash tabs, those are just gonna transfer between Path of Exile 1 and 2. That is honestly huge as far as I'm concerned, and not something I would expect from a lot of developers of games, them to take the convenience features that you purchased in a prior game and move it into the sequel. That ain't happening in a lot of games. So it's just not happening. So it's pretty cool that they're doing that here. One of the second major things that I'm looking forward to and really excited about, honestly, is the improved combat in the game. So in general, they've really been emphasizing in their showcase a lot of the work that they've done to improve gameplay feel. Gameplay feel has frankly been one of my biggest critiques of Path of Exile over the years, even though, yes, I haven't been like habitually playing it since 2011. In the early days when I played, that was one of my major criticisms. Like, I think the game's cool. It's got a lot of going for it, but I always felt like gameplay feel was just slightly behind some of the competition. But they are clearly making some big improvements, and even just from watching these gameplay clips, it is pretty obvious. Now, beyond doing things like, what does it mean to make combat feel better? Well, they're making big strides as far as I can tell in their animations and improving the sounds. Probably, I'm assuming, working on things like improved input latency, although I don't know that that was necessarily an issue. But a lot of these things, the animations, the sounds, all of these things kind of play into what it means to have good feeling combat in games, and they're clearly making some work here. But they're also making big strides in improving mobility in the game. So for one, nearly every single melee skill and many of the range skills in PoE 2 will now have some sort of built-in mobility. This might be like a forward step or a backward dash, depending on the skill, the type, all of that. But yes, many of the skills will either have a short range or medium to long range mobility built into it. On top of that, the direction of a lot of these attacks can be adjusted post activating the skill. So if you have a skill that has like a long animation, a long wind up to it, but where you happen to aim it when you initially cast it, if where you need it to be changes mid animation, you can actually change it mid animation. So if you start up a swing and then it moves behind you, you can swing your mouse around and have it actually attack behind you. That is a good improvement, which all just plays into better feeling combat. If it's more responsive, if it feels more impactful, all of these things do make a big difference. And there's also now a baseline level dodge roll. Doesn't matter what class you're playing, it's not class specific. Everybody gets a dodge in the game. There are no cooldowns or charges on these dodges. You can just spam them as much as you want, far as I can tell. And although they don't make you invulnerable, like you will still get hit by ground effects. AoEs in particular will still hit you if you're within their range, wherever they are on the ground or cast from the sky or whatever. Those things will still hit you. However, while you are in the rolling animation, projectiles and melee strikes will always miss. So it's a great way not only to reposition yourself, but it's also a great way to avoid some damage. Dodging also on top of that is going to let you cancel the animation for most of the skills in the game. All of these things I'm talking about really go a long way into making combat feel better. That responsiveness, that crispness on top of the hopefully what looks to be improved impactfulness feeling of it. And all of this extra movement in particular, many of the melee skills and even some range skills getting movement with the inclusion of a baseline dodge. All of this I think is going to open up a lot more options for encounter design in the game as well. You know, in Path of Exile 1, you basically either had a dedicated movement skill that you were using, something along the lines of a blink, and the basic movement, just like walking your character around. And those were the two ways you were avoiding and repositioning yourself in combat in Path of Exile 1. But with all of these extra movement skills built into those abilities, plus the dodge roll, they can just design encounters, boss fights in particular, that take all of that extra movement into consideration. And that is, I think, just going to make for a lot more potentially interesting, a lot more encounters there. Speaking of combat across the board, at least in the showcases they've showed us so far, does appear to be slowed down a little bit. The ideal scenario here is this is going to make for encounters that don't just devolve into you just like stacking damage and one-shotting the entire screen, which yes, was a lot of the case. I know myself as I followed Path of Exile over the years, watching streamers and gameplay videos and like updated reviews. I'm like, boy, it's just like constantly running and everything's dying on the screen. It's just like explosions and running. Like that seemed like it was a majority of the game from that outside perspective that I had. But clearly in the boss fights and even just the regular mobs they're fighting, things seem to be tuned down a little bit. Now, I'm assuming, and I do believe that they've said that there will still be plenty of faster paced combat. Also bear in mind, most of what we saw in these showcases was like leveling up content, and this is before you get to the end game, the builds really start to flesh out, you're getting all of your skill points and your passives, and these synergies start working and everything starts coming online. That is usually the case where things start to speed up quite a bit. But even just general baseline early on, the fact that things are tuned in a little bit more, I do just think, especially when it comes to boss fights, it just makes it more interesting if it's not just like zerking down the health bar, if you're having to pay a lot more attention to mechanics. Just looked good, really, is what I would say. And speaking of the improved combat, there's a lot of new features and mechanics, some combat related, some otherwise. So for combat related features and mechanics, we get the fact that all CC crowd control abilities in the game will now build up to basically either a freeze or a stun. So previously a lot of the bosses were either immune to stun and freeze, or they were susceptible to it. It was like a binary thing, right? So it basically made it so that freeze effects were useless on many of the encounters. If you had a freeze effect, if you had a freeze skill, it basically just became a dead ability in those situations where you had an immune enemy. Well, now it is the case that every single enemy in the game can be hard CC'd. There will just be some sort of a meter that you will have to build up before that CC is applied, but it still will make it useful in every single encounter. You're never going to have like a useless hard CC. On top of that, they've also added this new resource, Spirit. It's a dedicated resource specifically used for any ongoing effects. So they gave some examples, things like Arctic Armor, any of the game's auras or minions. And this is a massive change because in Path of Exile 1, these sort of abilities a lot of time would basically just drain your mana pool, effectively reducing the maximum amount of mana. So what ended up happening is a lot of players would be running around with these ongoing effects, these shields, these auras or minions, and they would just have like no mana to use. It drastically reduces their mana pool. So instead of having that be the case, they have now a dedicated resource just 100% for these ongoing effects. You've got the Spirit in addition to your mana. So you can use your mana for casting all of your skills, what have you. And you also have a separate resource to consider in Spirit when it comes to your ongoing effects. And the Spirit resource can be increased through various means. They said, for example, I believe the offhands, some offhands in the game, I think it was scepters, are a great source of getting additional Spirit if you're wanting to stack more of these armors or these auras or have more minions. Another big new addition is the fact that caster weapons like staffs, for example, will now all come with a built-in free to cast ability. So, and it could be a variety of abilities in the game. They gave an example of this fireball, but this replaces the old basic kind of lame attack that caster weapons had that pretty much no one ever used. They just weren't good. They weren't a good source of damage. They didn't have any synergies. You never used use it except for maybe when you first like washed up on the beach and it was the only thing you had and you didn't have, it was just like one of your 2 skills, right? So you might use your basic attack then, but after not very long, you would never use the caster weapon basic attack. Well, now potentially going to be some builds, or at least that's what they're going for. They want people to be able to use these basic attacks from these caster weapons, and I think that is really, really interesting. They also want people to start using weapon swapping because that was just not the case at all. Very few people seem to use weapon swapping in Path of Exile 1. Well, now weapon swapping is a lot easier because you basically don't have to think about it. So what's happening now is you can essentially set which weapon will be used. You've got the 2 weapon slots, and you can now set which weapon is used for your individual skills. So for example, if you have a weapon that does increased fire damage, you can set it so that anytime you cast the fireball ability, you will automatically swap to that weapon. And then you can have another staff that say does increase like electric or cold damage, and you'll automatically switch to that whenever you use an electric skill or a cold skill, and you can just predetermine all of this. Now it does require some going into the menus and clicking and selecting, okay, for this particular skill, only use this weapon slot, and then you got to make sure that weapon slot is the one that synergizes with that skill. But once you set that all up and you're actually in combat, you just hit the skill. When you hit the skill, it will go to the appropriate weapon that synergizes with that skill. That is a really great move. You know, I think I always feel like I've liked weapon swapping in theory, but in practice, it ends up being a bit clunky. And there's a lot of different games that do this. Elder Scrolls Online has a weapon swapping mechanic. Guild Wars 2 has a weapon swapping mechanic. And it just feels like having to manually either push the button or do the mouse scroll wheel to swap from one weapon to the other, especially when things get hectic. I always find that occasionally when I'm playing these games, in the heat of everything, I'll forget which weapon set that I'm on, and I'll click ability for the wrong weapon and like using the wrong bar, and I'll have to double check my skill bar to get a reminder like, hey, which bar am I using? Which skills are activating when I'm hitting, you know, Q, W, E, or R, or hitting 1, 2, 3, or 4, or whatever. And that really takes you away from focusing on what you're supposed to be focusing on the PvE encounter, whether that's a boss fight, or focusing on your enemies if you're on PvP. You want to be able to look at the action on the screen and pay attention to the characters and the animations. You don't want to be looking at your bar. So the fewer bar checks you can do, the better. And it always seems to be the case that there will be circumstances when we have weapon swapping in these games. Things get really hectic and I'm just like, I don't remember which set I'm on and I'm in the wrong one, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. So to just make it like an auto, something that you set up, you predetermine, and you're just focusing on hitting your baseline abilities and not worrying about which hotbar you're currently on, that's a really good change. And I think it's just going to make for some better feeling combat and open up a lot more options as a result, and a lot more synergies, at least, between the weapons and the skills that you've selected. And speaking of those synergies, they've also made it so that there are going to be separate passive skill trees for each weapon set. So you've got weapon set 1 and 2, and now you can line up these passive bonuses for each particular weapon set that you have to match, say, things like elemental damage types, or to match, say you want one weapon set that's focused on applying debuffs and another one that's focused on dealing damage. Not all passives, but there will be select passives that you'll be able to pick for each of those weapon slots. Again, all of this just means a lot more synergies. They've updated gems as well, now implementing these uncut gems. So instead of just getting skill-specific gems that drop, which if you're not familiar, one cool thing that Path of Exile has always done, it's in PoE 1, is that they drop gems that just are skills, right? So instead of just having like your character skills and you have only these many to select from, gems drop and those gems are skills. There's a fireball gem, there's a lightning thing gem, a frost nova gem, a blink gem, you know, everything that you expect from this type of game, there are gems associated with that. So in this game, instead of just only getting, like, you only get the leap attack gem, right? Well, now the gems will be dropping uncut and you'll be able to select from a range of abilities, and this is just going to make it so that you're going to have a lot more options to swap up and change gems. You won't just be relying on waiting to get that one particular one to drop. It just means more potential opportunities for people to play around with things, try different things, update their builds, swap builds, whatever. And they have said that they're going to be adding way more skill modification and utility to support gems. So this is like a sub gem system. You've got your main gem, the one that's the ability, and then support gems that enhance it. In the past, a lot of times this really just ended up resulting in people were just doing damage modifiers, increasing the damage of whatever their baseline skill was. Well, they want to focus more on utility and modification. So think things like increased attack speed, adding move speed, adding multi-shot, adding additional debuffs or proc chances. A lot of different opportunities are now going to be coming from these support gems instead of just like bumping up the base damage of your baseline skill. Another big thing that is coming with Path of Exile 2 is Over 100 bosses. That's a large number of bosses for this game to be launching with. So there are going to be 6 acts to play in this game, and as you play through the campaign, within each act are a bunch of different segmented off areas, and every single one of those areas contains a boss fight, resulting in over 100 unique bosses in the game. And they were very clear here, these are unique bosses. These are not just upscaled versions of normal or elite enemies. You're not seeing the same enemies, but bigger, dealing more damage. No, these are unique with their own attack patterns, their own mechanics, their own phases, everything. 100 unique one of these. And this is pre-end game, mind you. This is as you're going through the campaign. The end game is going to introduce its all new suite of modified, changed enemies and presumably new enemies, bosses to fight in the game. That is a big number. Another ARPG that launched not too long ago. You probably know the one I'm talking about. I'm pretty sure it has like 40 total unique bosses in the game, and some of those were just upscaled versions of normal enemies. So Path of Exile 2, some big strides here for the genre in that case. And I gotta say, a lot of the fights that they showcased, even the few boss fights that I've seen in PoE 2, pretty interesting mechanics. You know, a lot of it does, of course, boils down to what you expect from like action RPG fights. You're dodging the attack, you're trying to not stand in the fire. That's all ultimately, in a lot of cases, what it all comes down to. But I think they add a lot of visual variety here, and like pacing variety and positioning variety. Just these fights just looked interesting. And beyond looking interesting, they looked tough. In general, they've said they're trying to make Path of Exile 2 a difficult game, and that seems pretty clear. Like, it's taken a while to work down their health bar. They're not like insta-gibbing these bosses, and the bosses also have a lot of parts of their ability suite and particular circumstances in which they dish out a ton of damage. In fact, we saw the developers die in several occasions throughout the 2-day showcase of them of ExileCon. There were several instances where the people playing died in boss fights, and even some non-boss fights and some trash encounters as well. So great, love to see difficulty in these games. I personally really appreciate it. Also, bunch of new classes and associated skills and builds with this. So in Path of Exile 2, they are introducing 6 brand new base classes to the game. These are the Warrior, the Huntress, the Sorceress, the Mercenary, the Monk, and the Druid. Now this, along with the 6 from the first game, those will be coming in as well, will make for a total of 12 classes when Path of Exile 2 launches. And keep in mind, each of these also branch off into multiple Ascendancy classes, making for a total of 36 Ascendancies. Now, Ascendancies, they're basically like new specialized versions of the base class. Each Ascendancy opens up an entirely new unique skill tree that can drastically change how the base class plays. It really functions like its own unique classes. So there are 12 base classes, but as far as you're concerned, there's like 36 classes in Path of Exile 2. Pretty cool. This on top of the fact that there are now going to be in total 1,500 passive skills, 240 active skills. This all results in loads of customization opportunity, of player choice, of build variety. It's something that's always been touted in Path of Exile, and it seems like they're just ramping that up to 11 or 12, I guess, in Path of Exile 2. Pretty cool. I love to see this. And although the build and theory crafting isn't something that I've ever personally gotten into in a lot of these games, I just like to see and check out a lot of the interesting builds that the hardcore community comes up with. I've always heard a lot of great things about the build variety and interesting builds in Path of Exile, and it seems like that is just getting better here in the sequel, which is pretty cool to see. So finally, Path of Exile 2, when are we going to get to play it? Well, looks like the beta is planned for about a year from now. It's coming out on June 7th, 2024. They have made note, hey, we want to make sure we get this right. We do not want to rush it. We want to, when this game comes out, we want to really feel like it's a finished, complete product, and we're polishing everything up, adding enough content, all of that. So love to see it. There you go. That is what I am most interested in, what I think is the coolest from Path of Exile 2, from what we saw from the recent ExileCon. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to the game. As a lot of you know, I play ARPGs, I play MMOs, I like these style of games quite a lot. I played Path of Exile back in the day. I can't believe it's been like 12 years. Yeah, I went back and checked. 2011, I've got beta playthroughs of that game from when I first played it. And it's kind of, the base game's come a long way since, and they appear to be making leaps and bounds improvements in the sequel here. And I'm really glad, I gotta reiterate, I'm really glad that they're making it their own game, because not only can people bounce between PoE 1 and 2, but maybe some people who don't love all the changes in PoE 2, they can just play PoE 1 as well. They're not deleting that game, essentially. They're making sure each of them stand on their own, and I think ultimately that is probably the best decision. I'm going to be talking about this game in the future, guarantee it. All right, I planned on it in general. Again, I guess thanks Grinding Gear Games for sponsoring this video, because I am more than happy to talk about it, because this game looks pretty darn cool. That's it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Take it easy.